Well, good morning, everyone. This morning, I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Sulmasy, who serves as our inaugural Andre Helliger's Professor of Biomedical Ethics with joint appointments in our Department of Philosophy and Medicine. He was recently named director for our Kennedy Institute of Ethics and serves at our Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics. Dan, since you graduated with your doctorate in philosophy here, nearly 3 decades ago, it's been wonderful to have you back now as a member of the community, to have your leadership now at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. I want to thank you for taking the time for being with us for this conversation. Tell us a little bit about what first interested you in the questions that we confront in bioethics. How did this come to be the direction of your scholarship?
Well, I think a lot of it came from my experience really as a clinician, and particularly even starting as a medical student. I mean, I remember very vividly being sort of very proud of myself as an acting intern, as a fourth-year medical student, to have made a diagnosis that a woman with breast cancer who had come in because of shortness of breath actually had a tumor pressing on her spinal cord. It's very serious condition, and it had not been known by the doctors, the official doctors, and I had sort of come up with this. It was confirmed by the test that was done. And I remember very vividly that the neurologist who came in to inform her of this came in with his entourage of people in shorter white coats and medical students and residents, and he was South African and had a bit of an accent, and said, "Lady, you've got a big fat tumor stuck on your spinal cord, and we're gonna have to give you some radiation so you won't get paralyzed, okay?" And he walked out of the room. And then I, as a medical student, was really left with a weeping mess of a woman who didn't understand what was going on. It was that kind of experience that was not all that atypical that led me to really have the conviction that we needed to do something more with the way we practiced medicine, to think more globally about the care of patients as whole persons, to think better about how we communicate with them and the kinds of decisions we make. And I had a little bit of philosophy as well. I began to think of myself after an experience in Thailand as not being set out for the missions because I didn't like heat and humidity. I seemed to like philosophy, and that there would be the possibility of really doing something very serious in a scholarly way about the practice of medicine.
And you continue to balance the two, the practice of medicine and your work in biomedical ethics. Can you talk a little bit about how you do that?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't like to stop practicing. I continue to see patients to this very day, and I think it has many values to it. One is that if I think of something while I'm philosophizing and I can't put it into action, then it's not worth the electrons I've spilled on the screen writing about it. It does give me also the ability to sort of test what I've done that way. It gives me street cred, if you will, among my fellow clinicians who can't say that I'm just an ivory tower philosopher, right? That I can say, as was the case when I was treating Mrs. Jones last week, this is the way I think we ought to approach the question. And last, I just really like it. I like medicine. I consider it a calling, and I continue to want to be able to practice and to teach. And so, for me, moving back and forth between the two, in essence, philosophy for me is the basic science of clinical ethics, just as there are physician scientists who study biochemistry or genetics. So I'm studying philosophy about the ethics of our practice.
Now, you've explored a wide range of issues, from end-of-life decision-making to spirituality in medicine, questions of informed consent, ethics education. Describe for us the kinds of questions you've been focused on and some of the insights that are important for our thinking on these issues.
Well, there's a wide range of questions, and I have been someone who's explored a lot of them, and even in different ways. Sometimes I've describe myself as an MD with a PhD in philosophy, practicing social science without a license, because I have done some empirical studies too, and I'll give you an example of one of those, and the ways in which empirical work and theoretical work can interdigitate. One of the things that bioethical theory for many years has said is that when a patient can't speak for himself or herself, that the way to make decisions is to ask, what would the patient have wanted were the patient able to speak to us? You may have had this experience with your own loved ones, right? So we're going to say, well, mom can't tell us what she'd want, whether she'd want to be on the ventilator, but what do you think she would say? So that's the theory, right? It's called substituted judgment. I did an empirical study in which we put the patient in one room and their surrogate decision maker in another, sort of the bioethics version of the newlywed game, if you will. We asked the patient, what would you, if you were to be terribly sick tomorrow and unable to speak for yourself, would you want to go on a ventilator, get cardiopulmonary resuscitation, and then ask the loved one, what do you think the patient is saying? I don't know what you want to, if you want to venture a guess, but it was better than chance, 66% right. That means wrong 1 out of 3 times, right? And so what it said to me is that we, in some ways, maybe ought to rethink the standard, because as Kant would say, ought implies can, right? And we can't set a standard for people that they're actually not able to put into practice. So that's the kind of way I think in which some of these things can interdigitate. And then maybe one other in end-of-life care about spirituality, maybe to talk a little bit about the word hope and the way it functions for people at the end of life. And some people say, oh, we need to reframe the hopes of patients who are dying, because as they get sicker, maybe they can't hope to be cured, but maybe they can hope to be able to survive long enough to see a grandchild graduate from Georgetown, or maybe if that's not possible, they can hope to be pain-free. Part of what I've commented on is that being terminally ill doesn't make you stupid, right? That the person who's hearing this knows that the focus is narrowing with every reiteration of what they can hope for. And so I think that when we think about hope for someone who's dying, we have to have a more expansive vision of what hope means. And perhaps I could quote from Václav Havel, who says that hope is not the belief that things are going to turn out well, but the conviction that they will make sense no matter how they turn out. And to hope for a sense of meaning in the midst of our suffering, in the midst of our dying, is a deeper way of addressing what hope means for a dying patient.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, the coronavirus has brought many questions about ethics to the forefront of our national conversation as we think about decisions relating to end of life and elder care, scarcity of resources, overcrowding in hospitals, vaccine distribution. How should we approach these issues to ensure that ethics are included as important aspects of our planning and response? Are there ways this moment has either changed your perspective on how we grapple with these questions or the way you approach a particular issue in your scholarship?
Well, I think it's made clear, if people hadn't thought of it before, how important bioethics really is, right? Because all of these questions that we're confronting, who should be vaccinated, who gets ventilators, are all really ethical questions, and they're not merely ivory tower questions about who gets to be in the lifeboat. I mean, we are in the lifeboat now, and we have to decide in a concrete way. And it's led to 2 kinds of things. One has been actual engagement. So I've been working with the DC Department of Health. They have a subcommittee on ethics for figuring out the best way to distribute vaccines, taking into account questions about who needs them, the vaccine the most, but also questions of justice, particularly in terms of minorities that are disadvantaged and don't have access, perhaps, to some of these resources. So there's a way in which scholarship has to be engaged that way, and a way in which philosophers can be invited in to work with government officials to help to make that happen. But it has also raised some questions for me that are more scholarly, and I've been publishing in journals and writing articles. I'm concerned about questions like the role of age as a criterion in the distribution of ventilator access or vaccine access, and how we can set ourselves up too readily, thinking in too concretely utilitarian a way for the possibility of discriminating against the elderly, discriminating against the disabled. So it's led me to writing in journals about these kinds of questions at a more at a deeper philosophical level.
Sure, sure. Now, you recently took on the role as director of our Kennedy Institute of Ethics, one of the places that has defined this field over the past 5 decades. Can you talk a little bit about the Institute and the kinds of work that you and your colleagues are engaged in?
Well, as you just pointed out, this fall will be the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, which has been one of the founding institutions in the field of bioethics. The Hastings Center in New York was a year before, but basically some of the leading lights in the field, Edmund Pellegrino, Robert Veitch, Tom Beecham, have been part of the faculty here, have written textbooks that have taught medical students, nursing students, and others how to think about these questions. And so there's a great heritage. But as many of those figures have retired or sadly passed away, we're at a sort of critical junction now for the Kennedy Institute, and looking to sort of reboot ourselves and move towards engaging the future. And some of the questions that my colleagues are beginning to address now, for instance, Maggie Little is working in questions about data ethics, some of which are part of the ethics of medicine, how we deal with our genetic data, how we deal with health information, but also go beyond healthcare ethics into what happens to your GPS record from your phone and your credit card information. There are still people like myself and John Keown who are working on basic clinical ethics problems. We're working with the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics more aggressively in that way of trying to work together more than we have in the past to look at those clinical kinds of questions. There are also ways in which questions of justice are cross-cutting, not only racial justice, but questions of global justice. If you're thinking about vaccine distribution, we have sometimes too narrow a focus to think about our questions of how we distribute them within this country, but pandemic means the whole world, right? And so part of our response to the pandemic has been to engage with our global health program to have a webinar, which was attended by 600 people from around the world on questions of global justice and the distribution of vaccines. So we have new questions, new technologies, and there's plenty for us to do, and we're beginning to engage that and want to continue to do it for the next 50 years.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Now, you mentioned the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics here at Georgetown. As a student, you worked closely with Dr. Pellegrino, the founding director of the center. You later directed the center. Can you talk about the mentorship that Dr. Pellegrino provided and how that time shaped your perspective on the practice of medicine and the study of bioethics? Perhaps not everyone who will be watching this interview will know who Dr. Pellegrino was.
Well, then it's my privilege to be able to do the best I can to introduce them to Edmund Pellegrino, a really incredible man who grew up in the same neighborhood, by the way, in Brooklyn as Anthony Fauci. A few years older, but not by much, not by much. Ed Pellegrino was a true mentor, an incredible teacher, a man whose CV was divided into two parts, like a wine list of red and white. He did empirical basic research about calcium in the distal tubule of the kidney, but mostly did work in medical ethics, was one of the people who was the founder of the field. Back starting in the 60s, he was really beginning to write about this. Before there was a Kennedy Institute, he was doing bioethics. A man who lived what he wrote. It was really always an inspiration to be around him. He taught me how to write elegant phrases that I still remember and try to teach medical students, like therapeutic parsimony and diagnostic elegance, which is a wonderful insight into the philosophy of medicine, but has a lot of wisdom in terms of how we practice. Only the least amount of testing and the least amount of treatment that's necessary to make somebody better. And that's good for them, good for the economy, and it's good intellectually to be thinking that way. I was just absolutely privileged to be around him, to learn about ethics, to learn about medicine. His portrait is in the medical school in the lobby, and people should go by once they've got a chance to come back on campus and look at it. And he's got both, the artist has both a beaker for his scientific work and a couple of books, maybe of Aquinas, actually in the background. So.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Now, you've participated in a number of different public capacities. In 2010, you were appointed a member of the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues here in the US, and on the Vatican's Pontifical Academy for Life, an appointment made by Pope Francis. Can you reflect on the role that these organizations play and the kinds of questions they enable you to engage?
Yeah, I think that having sort of public, national and international forums for engaging in bioethics is really critical. And I'm hopeful that the new administration will have another presidential commission on bioethics of some sort, because we have continually before us new questions. I mean, this virus, for instance, did not exist 15 months ago, at least as far as we know. And now it does, and we've got a world pandemic, and we need to reflect on those kinds of questions and learn from our response. When I was on the Obama Commission, we looked at questions like, a lot of them were about emerging technologies, like something called synthetic biology, which even my medical school classmate who's a liver transplant surgeon didn't know what it was. So it's really cutting edge, a sort of meld between molecular biology and engineering, and the ethical questions that raises, some of which are medical, some of which are environmental, some of which have to do with even national security, whether somebody can create a new form of biological weapon. So those kinds of questions, some of which were backward looking. We looked at the US experiments in Guatemala that a lot of people aren't even aware of, I suspect, that we conducted after the Second World War, in which we purposefully infected, the US government purposefully infected prisoners, psychiatric patients, and soldiers with syphilis and gonorrhea to see if penicillin would work, while we were trying the Nazis of Nuremberg. I mean, it's just amazing to read this history and try to learn from it, and to have a commission that can bring this sort of stuff to light and help us to learn from it. At the international level, well, in some ways, medicine and biomedicine and viruses don't have borders, and we've learned that, right? And so these questions really are international. And part of what the Pontifical Academy for Life allows is really international reflection on some of these questions in bioethics, and also in ways that I think anticipate some of the goals that we have here at Georgetown, is looking to see the interconnections between data ethics, environmental ethics, and bioethics, because they do all interact. And so I'm really excited by the fact that simultaneously the Pope and Georgetown are thinking globally and thinking about the interaction between these three very important pockets of ethical questions that we are facing as a world.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And Dan, thank you for taking the time for this conversation. Congratulations on your new responsibilities here at Georgetown. I can't imagine a better person to lead the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at this moment in its history as we celebrate its 50th and look forward to its next stage of development in just the way you've described. In closing, is there a message you'd like to share with our community?
Well, first, to thank you for having me and for your kind words, but to just say to everybody that I think bioethics is for everybody, not just for doctors and nurses, not just for philosophers, because of the ways in which medical technology intersects with our lives. From birth to child rearing, to reproduction, to sexuality, to death. Medicine is there in deep ways in our lives, and we need to reflect very seriously about the ways in which we make decisions about how to deploy that technology. And that's what the Kennedy Institute's going to try to help us do over the next 50 years.
Well, thank you. And thank you again for taking this time for this conversation. And thank you all for joining us. I look forward to being with all of you again soon. Take care of yourselves and take care of everyone around you. For every Hoya, everywhere.